The town of Salem, Massachusetts was settled in 1629, and most of the people there were all English Protestants and had Puritan beliefs, which means that they had very strict moral codes and usually very strict moral codes. At the time, there was no explanation for natural disasters, misfortune, and the world of diseases that came to the people who settled in the new Americas. So being of Puritan faith, most people assumed that any act against them or any bad day was always an act of Satan. They also believed that Satan would recruit his own witches and wizards in the human world to work for him and cause bad fortune. They would use diseases like smallpox that came upon them, or even bad fortune in the war, to explain any signs that Satan might have been at work behind the scenes. About 50 years later, in 1688, following an argument that had happened with laundress Goody Glover, Martha Goodwin, who was only 13, begins exhibiting bizarre behavior. Days later, her younger brother and two sisters started to show the same kind of behavior. Glover was arrested and tried for bewitching the Goodwin children. They believed that she was a witch because of their bizarre behavior, and it was signs of Satan at work. Reverend Cotton Mather meets twice with Glover following her arrest in an attempt to persuade her to repent her witchcraft. Glover is then hanged, and Mather takes Martha Goodwin into his house, and her bizarre behavior begins to continue and worsen. Later on in 1688, Mather then publishes memorable providences relating to witchcraft and possessions, which leads people to believe that he knows more on the subject of witches and wizards and the acts of Satan in the world than others would. On January 20th, 1692, 11-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris begin behaving much like the Goodwin children did 4 years earlier. Soon, Ann Putnam Jr. and other Salem girls begin acting similarly. Only a month later, Dr. Griggs suggests that the girls are afflicted and says that witchcraft may be the cause of their strange behavior. Then that same month, on February 25th, 1692, Tituba, at the request of neighbor Mary Sibley, bakes a witch cake and feeds it to a dog. According to an English folk remedy, feeding a dog this kind of cake, which contained the urine of the afflicted, would counteract the spell put on Elizabeth and Abigail. The reason the cake is fed to a dog because the dog is believed to be a familiar of the devil. Towards the end of February, after being pressured by the ministers and town people to say who caused her odd behavior, Elizabeth identifies Tituba, and the girls later accuse Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne of witchcraft. On March 1st, just a couple days later, John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin examined Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne for witch teats. Tituba confesses to practicing witchcraft and confirms Good and Osborne were both her co-conspirators. Later that spring, the proctor's servant and accuser, Mary Warren, admits to lying and accuses the other girls of also lying. Not too much later, Mary Warren reverses her statement and rejoins the accusers. Later that same year, finally now in June, Bridget Bishop is the first to be tried and convicted of witchcraft. She is sentenced to death. 8 days later, Bridget Bishop is hanged at Gallow Hill. Following the hanging, Nathaniel Saltonstall resigns from the court and is replaced by Corwin. On June 29th and 30th, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wild, Sarah Good, and Elizabeth Howe are tried and pronounced guilty and sentenced to hang for witchcraft. By July 19th, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Good and Sarah Wilds are all hanged at Gallows Hill as well. The next month on August 5th, George Jacobs Sr., Martha Carrier, George Burroughs, John Willard, and John and Elizabeth Proctor are pronounced guilty and sentenced to hang. Within 14 days, everyone is hanged at Gallows Hill except for Elizabeth Proctor, who was not hanged because she was pregnant at the time. Then on August 20th, the next day, Margaret Jacobs recants the testimony that led to the execution of her grandfather, George Jacobs Sr. and Burroughs. The next month, on September 17th, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Redd, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Abigail Faulkner, Rebecca Earns, Mary Lacey, Ann Foster, and Abigail Hobbs are tried and all sentenced to hang for witchcraft as well. Only a few days after, on September 22nd, Martha Corey, Margaret Scott, Mary Eastie, Alice Parker, Ann Puditer, Wilmot Redd, Samuel Wardwell, and Mary Parker are hanged. Cora escapes execution by confessing to her crimes. The following year, January of 1693, 49 of the 52 surviving people brought into the court on witchcraft charges were released because their arrests were based on spectral evidence. And in May of 1693, Phillips pardons those still in prison on witchcraft charges, ending the Salem Witch Trials. The Salem Witch Trials have come to represent the kind of mass paranoia and xenophobia that can inflict communities under distress. When times become difficult, many seek to blame others, and it is not difficult to arouse the kinds of passions within a group of already frightened people against those accused of causing hardship. After over 200 people were accused of witchcraft and 20 killed for committing the act or conspiring with witches, the Salem Witch Trials truly represented how fragile a society can be in the face of a perceived threat, and were a precursor to a pattern that would be repeated around the world for centuries, including in the United States.